Today's scripture is from the book of Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 20. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property to dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him." This is the word of the Lord.
Back in the summer of 1999, which I'm realizing as I sat over there was a quarter century ago. I know, sorry. I spent a summer in between my last couple years of college working in Germany. And when I was there, for the first month or so I was there, I was basically bound to walk everywhere because I didn't have any other way of getting anywhere but walk. And thankfully, Germany has these things called trains, and trains take you places, which is fun. But after about a month, the guy I was working for bought himself a new car and asked if I wanted to use his old car for the rest of my time there, to which I said, absolutely, I want to do that. Because we had to go places and do things, and so I had been riding with him on especially the Autobahn, and it kind of lived up to the hype a little bit as far as I could tell, and I was really excited to give it a try. That this young man from eastern Montana was super excited to get this chance. And so I'm like, yes, please, I would love to have it. And so I would occasionally have to go out on these longer drives to reach clients or wherever it is we needed to go. And about halfway through one of those trips, I realized I had forgotten to bring anything with me, and I was getting thirsty. So I stopped at a place on the side of the road where you could get something to drink. And I noticed that gas stations in other countries are weird. They're not like ours. So don't think about Buc-ee's. It wasn't anything like that. And one of the most thing I noticed is that while I could buy a soda, which I desperately wanted, I could only buy a small one. And I couldn't figure out why won't they sell me a big one? And so I'm like, well, now I got to buy 2. So I bought 2 of the small cans of soda, got back in the car, and it was only then that I realized in that particular car, I didn't have anywhere to put it. And I didn't have where to put it because there are no cup holders in the car that I was having. And so I go through my trip, and I get back, and I go talk to Jurgen, who's the guy I was working for, and I said, this is kind of weird. I'm like, and he really enjoyed it when I pointed out weird things about his country. Legitimately, he kind of thought Americans were kind of funny and goofy and silly. So I was like, yeah, it's kind of weird. You can't buy a giant soda. He's like, well, why would you want that? And I'm like, for the long trip. And he kept looking at me quizzically, and he just didn't understand. And I'm like, so you have something to drink on the long trip. And he kept looking at me quizzically. And then I said, so I just bought 2 smaller sodas, but there wasn't anywhere to put it. And then he continued to look at me like I had said something incredibly stupid, right? Sometimes you look at your children, you're like, really? You just said that. I love you all. Love you both. They're here today. It's so exciting. So and he's like, and it took me, we kind of went back and forth about it. And then he finally figured out, and he's like, wait a minute. Are you asking about drinking soda while you drive? And I'm like, yes. And he's like, why would you do that? And driving is a thing. Driving is the thing you were doing right there. And so I figured out, the sodas are small because you're supposed to drink them at the gas station before you get back into your car, right? You're not supposed to be sipping the whole way because driving the Autobahn is a fully encompassing experience all by itself. And I actually thought about this for a minute, and I have subsequently learned that for the longest time, yes, German automakers especially did not put cup holders in their car and did not understand why Americans wanted them, and eventually would insist upon having them because driving is the thing you are supposed to be doing at that time. You are not supposed to be distracted while you drive. And the one thing besides, having nice, flat roads and well-marked lanes and all that kind of stuff that they have especially in Germany on the Autobahn, is they've also specifically engineered their freeway system to be less distracting, or as least distracting as possible to the driver. And so if you compare it to like American highways, it becomes immediately obvious the differences. Can you tell the difference between these two? And I thought maybe it was just a Germany thing, but even when I was in the UK this summer with Vivian and we were on these long bus drives, I noticed even when you're on a major highway, there are not billboards every 20 feet, even in larger areas advertising things. That's not really a thing. And once you start to think about it, it becomes fairly obvious why that is so. Now, this is a memo that we have completely and thoroughly missed here in the United States. And I was curious what the state of distracted driving was, because you do hear about that, especially when it comes to things like cell phones and things like that. And so I started to Google, about basically the distraction of billboards and where we were as a country in this idea of, are billboards distracting? Well, this billboard kind of speaks to the state of it for us. And this is actually linked to an article from Springfield, Oregon, not any of the other Springfields, but Springfield, Oregon. But there's this great quote in there from the people group that put this up. They said, "I wanted to try to reach new people in a new way about the importance of not driving distracted. So I thought, why not a billboard?" I'm like, billboards don't work if they don't capture your attention, at least for a small amount of time, thus distracting you. And that's kind of the state of the world we live in right now, where we are constantly inundated with things that are literally designed to distract us. And we're so, frankly, used to and immersed in it that the only time we notice it, the only time I've ever noticed it, is when I was in another country where those things don't exist, right? Billboards are conspicuous by their absence, right, in places like Germany and the UK, because we are so used to living in a world that is constantly competing for our attention, because, quite frankly, our attention is really, really valuable. And advertisers know it, and companies know it, and marketers know it, and they know how important and how valuable our attention is. And so they spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year, not only putting up billboards to advertise to us whatever they want to advertise as to us, but they also spend millions of dollars on lobbying to make sure nobody gets the wise idea that maybe these are a bad idea and tries to pass any laws against them. That's about as political as you'll ever hear me get. So we are inundated, and we live in a world where we are constantly being distracted, and things are constantly trying to distract against us. And let's be honest, right from the beginning, everything we're going to talk about in the next couple of weeks about all of the things that can and do distract us, the deck is thoroughly stacked against us. Because there are people with a lot more money than anybody in this room has, who very, very much wants a little bit of our time and a little bit of our attention so they can sell us whatever it is they want to sell us. So this idea of making sure that we understand how and when and why we are being distracted by life, and when and where and why the world around us is actively trying to distract us from the most important things, is important. Now, the story we read for this morning, the Prodigal Son, is probably a familiar one, right? The idea of being a prodigal son is one of those things that sort of entered the nomenclature, right there with like the Good Samaritan. In fact, some people may not even know that the Prodigal Son and the Good Samaritan are actually Bible stories. They are. And the basics of what we know about the prodigal son is fairly commonly well known, even amongst people who do not attend church regularly. And of course, it's a story about somebody who is a son that is rather ungrateful, seems rather ungrateful, is demanding to receive his inheritance early, goes off, squanders it, and then has to come, and then after he has squandered it all, then returns home. And so the returning of the prodigal son is the part that we often focus on. Today, we actually want to focus on the first part of the story. And that's what it is that he is about at the beginning. Now, this comes relatively quickly. We don't get a lot of details about what was going on with this kid before. But clearly, he comes from a family with means, and he was due to inherit something. Normally, he would not have inherited anything until his father died. But apparently his father, as far as his son was concerned, was annoyingly long-lived. And he wanted what he wanted, and he wanted it now. And so he went to his father and said, I want what I'm owed, and I want it now. And we're not entirely certain why, but we have some hints based on what he will eventually do, right? He doesn't say, I want what I want now, and then go so he can start his own farm, right? Or his own business, right? Or he can go to college, so college isn't a thing yet. Right? He's not asking for it so he can then go set off, become his own man, do his own thing, buy a ship and sail the seas or anything like that, right? So he's not asking for what he feels he is owed so that he can go and invest and build his future so he can get married or anything like that. He wants to go have fun. Right? And that's how we should translate. I can't remember exactly what this translation used. Different translations use different words for what it is the prodigal son goes and does. But basically, he goes and has the first century equivalent of a really amazing weekend in Vegas. Right? Probably a little bit longer. Probably a really amazing 6 months in Vegas. And we'll leave it at that. But that's basically what he does, and that's what he wants to do. And so there's something inside of him that is wanting this and craving this. Life in the first century isn't as exciting as a lot of the times and opportunities that we have. People didn't travel much. If you were born, whatever family you were born into, whatever they did is probably what you were going to do. We only talk about Jesus as a carpenter because one thing we know is his dad was a carpenter. And Joseph was a carpenter. If Joseph was a carpenter, then inevitably Jesus was going to train to be one. In this case, the father is a landowner, works in agriculture, grows things, has people around to help, hired hands to help him grow things. The sons that he has are inevitably going to do that same thing because that's just how it worked. So this son probably already knew could plan out pretty much exactly where he understood his life was going to go, what it was going to look like, what was expected of him. And there was something inside of him that craved something different. He wanted some excitement. He wanted some fun. He wanted some games. He wanted to go and do and live a more exciting existence than he had been living at the time. And so he asks for all of his possessions. But he can't actually take all of his possessions with him because one of the things that he would have been owed is land, and he can't take that. So he takes everything else that he was due to inherit that his father gave to him, carries it off so that he can have a few months of fun and games until it's all gone, and he ends up in the inevitable place we end up when that happens. And then he decides, well, you know what? Even the hired hands working back at my dad's place, even they are being treated better than I'm being treated here. So maybe I can go back home and he'll be willing to take me back, not as a son, because I've squandered that, but as a hired hand. This story comes in the midst of a long line of stories that Jesus is telling, long line of parables that Jesus is telling, because he's being accosted by the religious leaders of his day, questioning why he's doing what he's doing. They don't understand why he's hanging out with sinners. They don't understand why he's hanging out with the people that no good people would hang out with. They don't understand the message he's trying to preach. And so they are interrogating him more or less publicly about it. And Jesus decides to answer them with stories. And he first tells the story about a lost sheep that wanders off that is found. And then he tells a story about a woman who loses a coin and the joy that she has when she finds it. And then Jesus tells this story immediately after that. Jesus is a pretty bright guy, and I love the way he argues with people, right? Because he very rarely will come back directly at them, but instead likes to teach in stories and parables in order to help them understand and learn the lesson for themselves. Now, in those first two stories he tells, he talks about Jesus, he talks about the parable of the sheep, and he talks about the coin, right? The Pharisees have an out with those two stories, and I have no doubt that Jesus knows it. Of course, a shepherd who has a sheep that wanders off is excited when he goes and finds a sheep and brings it back. The sheep itself really isn't a problem at that point because sheep are stupid, right? Sheep wander off. It's not really their fault. We've bred them to be dumb, right? And so you can't really blame the sheep for wandering off. That's just what sheep do. And of course, you celebrate it when it comes back, right? The coin that the old lady loses in the story didn't lose itself, right? It didn't grow legs and walk off the table and hide itself under a thing, right? The woman lost the coin, and she was excited when she found it. So you can't blame the sheep and you can't blame the coin, right? And so you can almost see the Pharisees in their mind going, yes, but those, of course you're happy when you find those. And then he tells the story of the prodigal son. The story where the thing that is lost is not blameless. The thing that was lost was the son, and the son really wasn't lost as so much as he lost himself. And yet, in this story, it's the same. The response is the same. There's a celebration when the sheep is found, there's a celebration when the coin is found, and there's a celebration when the son returns. And the son is forgiven even though it's his fault. The son is forgiven even though the father didn't lose the son lost himself. It's never too late. It's never too late to reclaim our lives from the things that distract us. It's never too late to recognize that maybe we've been spending too much time and too much energy in the wrong places, and we instead would like to invest time and energy in the right places. Now, Jesus and God is not anti-fun, right? And I think sometimes the message of the church can sound like that. We can sound a bit downery around here, and I like to tell too many jokes for it to be true that God doesn't like fun, right? God's not against fun. God's not against rest. God isn't against this stuff. Jesus will go multiple times throughout the scripture and take times of rest. He will go off by himself. He will pray. He will meditate. He will do that over and over again, and he will tell his people to do the same. God is not against us having a good time. God's not against birthday parties. God's not against any of it. God joins us in our joys as well as our concerns. We talk about that every time we do joys and concerns. That's not what this is about. What it's about is when we do choose to rest, when we do choose to celebrate, when we do choose to do those things, are we doing them? When we choose to have fun and recreate and do the things that we like doing, are we doing them intentionally? Is it an intentional choice? Jesus makes an intentional choice when he is tired to go and rest and pray and rejuvenate himself, and we are invited to do the same. That is not a distraction in this way. No one would have, necessarily begrudged the son if he had been working hard to say, hey, I'd like to take a week off and maybe, go visit my brother down the street or whatever it is, right? Jesus is not anti-vacation. That's not what this is about. What happens to the son, though, is he gets so caught up in these distracted thoughts. He gets so caught up in the distractions the world can offer. He gets so caught up in the fun and games that are all around him, right? That instead of investing the time and energy he's been given, he chooses to give in to the distractions and make them the center of his life. Most of us today will not be given a similar opportunity to the prodigal son. Most of us, even if we were, wouldn't choose to do that. That doesn't tend to be the way that the world works for most of us. It's not a giant moment or a 6-month bender that many of us will go on. But the world has invented new ways to distract us, and instead of stealing 6 months from us at a crack, it now is more than content to steal 60 seconds or 6 minutes from us over and over and over again throughout the day. The advertisers with their billboards really only need you to look at it for 2 seconds. That's all they need and all they want. But those 2 seconds a day, or those 2 seconds per billboard with all the billboards and how many times, and I don't like driving on I-25 any more than I have to, and the billboards are only a small part of that. But all that time adds up. And of course, today, we've invented all these wonderful things that are on one hand really good and wonderful and productive, on the other hand, offer us no end of distraction. And of course, it's the things in our pockets. And I had actually a moment of thought a little bit ago while Carrie Ann was doing the children's message. I'm not sure I'm old enough to have a smartphone. I'm not sure this is a wise thing for me. And somewhere along the way, my smartphone updated itself and started offering this feature called Screen Time, which is delightfully willing to inform you how much time you've been spending on your phone, right? And I don't know if you all get this. Mine literally comes at like my weekly report for my screen comes at 8:30 in the morning on Sunday morning, which is not when I want it. And I'm like, stop bothering me. I've got work to do. Some of us work on Sundays. This is actually my screen time report, and I don't know if that's good or bad. But it'll tell you like whether it's up or down, you know? And now my son is actively studying my screen time report as I can see it. He is fixated on it back there. I see you, Kevin. I study yours too. All right. And now, of course, there's these amazing tools that you can put on your children's phones where you can actually limit how much time they can spend on all these various apps and all that stuff because we need it, because the things that are on there are so fun and so tempting. They are so, in many ways, almost intoxicating to us because they are designed to be that way, because people a lot smarter than most of us have figured out how to do it. Now, the truth is, the phones are fun, and I really appreciate having my phone and having the distractions it brings when I'm waiting in the doctor's office and don't have anything else to do, right? That's not necessarily the problem. The truth is, though, over time, these things can add up, and over time, it can become more than that. Over time, these little bits of time that we hand over, whether to our phones or the TV or YouTube or whatever it is, these little chunks of time that we hand over and over and over and over again can add up. And it's one thing if we are intentionally choosing to say, I'm taking this afternoon off, I'm going to rest, I need a break, my brain needs a break, I'm going to do something mindless for a while, and I'm going to watch a movie or I'm going to watch some show or whatever. I don't personally, and I don't think God thinks there's anything necessarily wrong with that. It's when we know that we probably have something else we ought to be doing, need to be doing, when we know there's something that we should be doing that God needs us to do or we need us to do, there's some important task out there, and instead of putting the time and the energy and effort into that, we look to our phones or our screens or whatever it is, that really compelling book that we're reading, and instead placate ourselves and our minds with those distractions. The prodigal son is welcomed home, despite the fact that he gave in a way most of us never would, to the fun and games of the world. He's welcomed home with open arms. The father wraps his hands around him, and in fact, in response to him being home, if you keep reading the story, throws him a party. And then there's the older son, which is a whole other sermon, which is super fun. The world is going to keep throwing distractions at us. It's not going to probably get a whole lot better. And in fact, they're probably going to keep finding new ways to try to distract us even more. It's never too late to reclaim our time. It's never too late to reclaim our focus. We are not supposed to, nor should we, beat ourselves up for what we've done in the past. The Father does not beat up the Son for the mistakes that he's made. The Father throws his arms around the Son, welcomes him home, and invites him to continue to invest his time, his life, and his energy in a better way. I am not here to tell us that any of us, myself included, need to feel bad about where we spent our time and energy. We are invited continuously by God to think about where we are. Where does our time go? Where do our resources go? Where does our attention go? And do those places that need it, those times where we have the opportunity to be Christ's hands, feet in the world, those times where we have to love God, neighbor, and ourselves a little bit more, are those times and opportunities we are each given getting as much attention as they should? Or are we allowing too many other things in to distract us? I think that is the story and the lesson that we should take today from the prodigal son. Fun and games are good. Rest is good. Recreation is good. But it is there for a reason. We are asked to invest that time and energy so that we can recover ourselves, our minds, our bodies, our spirits, so that we can go and do the important and harder things that God has us to do. The world will continue to distract us in all the ways that it knows how, but God will continue to be there to throw God's arms around us and to welcome us home when we choose to invest our time and our energy and our attention where God truly wants us to. Amen.